Good morning. My name is Darren Morgan, nursery manager at Shonnard's, and I wanted to talk today about native wildflowers, specifically starting native wildflowers from seeds and from bulbs. And so I'm going to ask everybody to please mute, and then I'm happy to take questions as we roll in the chat bar, but there will also be time at the end of the session if you want to unmute and ask verbal questions, and that'll be just fine. So, native wildflowers from seeds and bulbs. Always a fun topic, and it's a little different presentation than some of my other native presentations. Something a little more ability to do things in a larger scale economically. So, a couple of things about that. So, native wildflowers are wonderful in the sense of how they give a sense of place, a sense of location, integration with the local environment. These are the plants you expect to see here because these are the plants that grow wild out here. Native plants generally require less overall attention, care, and special consideration than introduced or non-native species. I say that with a caveat that our native plants often have very specific ecological niches that they fit, and putting the wrong plant in the wrong site does not make for a low maintenance, low input plant. It makes for a struggle. So it is very important that you pay attention to the specific needs and affiliations of those plants so that they're providing the appropriate home for them and you don't have to make it a struggle. Besides the aesthetic considerations of native wildflowers, our native plants provide ideal habitat for native birds, mammals, pollinators, and other native fauna. So these are the plants that these critters expect to find in the wild, that they have co-evolved with and adapted to. So they're a perfect fit for those animals and such. So planting native plants and native wildflowers specifically has a lot of advantages. Because today's talk is focused on wildflowers from seed and bulbs, we're not going to spend a lot of time on woody plants, on native trees and shrubs. That's not to say that there aren't a very nice array of native trees and shrubs that you could be working with, and some of them have very attractive flowers. The vast majority of those are done either from transplant rather from seed and bulb, and usually for good reason, either difficulty in germination or requiring many, many years from seed to an actually sellable condition. So we're going to be focusing on herbaceous plants, what would be normally called in the common vernacular wildflowers. So our native wildflowers comprise a fairly diverse group of plants. Some of them are annuals, some of them perennials. Some of them are somewhere in between. They share some characteristics of annuals and perennials. So just so we have our terminology clear as we go through the species by species part of the presentation, we'll talk just a little bit about that. An annual plant is a plant that grows for one season, but hits its reproductive maturity right away, sets seed, and then the parent plant dies. This is common in the trade in non-natives. Things like petunias are a good example. So while they don't have a long persistence, they do often have the ability to reseed quite well. Perennials come back year over year from an established root system, some sort of a storage unit, an established root system, a crown that that's a storage organ that can regrow roots and stems, or a more formal storage organ such as a bulb, corm, rhizome, or tuber. And perennials typically are persistent for substantially long periods of time. One of the trade-offs with perennials, if you are doing perennials from seed, they usually take several years to hit flowering maturity. So some perennials are long-lived. Others, lupins are a pretty good example, are short-lived perennials. They will perennialize. They'll come back from the parent root system for several years, but they're not really persistent over long periods of time. This is really common on plants that are first into a disturbed site, for example, that expect to be succeeded by larger plants coming in over time. Many short-lived perennials do reseed heavily, similar to annuals. And then right in between the annuals and the perennials are biennials. Biennials from the first year from seed will grow, get so big, and stop. They'll come back the following year to continue their growth, hit their reproductive maturity, set seed, and then die. There's a batch of natives that are effectively biennial, and some of the lupins are in that category as well. More common garden plants, if you want to put this in perspective for comparison, so understand the term, common biennials in the garden might include hollyhocks. Most hollyhocks are biennial. They grow first year from seed, and then they don't flower until the second year, and after flowering, the parent plant dies. In the vegetable garden, plants like chard is a good example. You plant out chard seed, it grows for a season. If you don't kill it off, get it too disease or too insect ridden, it goes dormant in the winter, puts on a flush of growth in the spring, and then sets seed late spring to summer, a typical biennial growth pattern. So those are the types of plants we're working with, and those are the characteristics of those different terms. So the question we get a lot when we're talking about establishing plants is, why would you do annuals? They just die. We have a pretty good array of very attractive wildflowers that are annual or biennial, or in some cases, very short-lived perennials. And they tend to actually establish themselves pretty well by reseeding significantly. And this is particularly true as long as conditions stay stable and suitable. Things that would stop them from reestablishing effectively are strong competition from aggressive weeds. They can be also changes in cover, like shade cover from plants maturing out and developing. So they tend to be persistent within limits. Annuals are a really good and inexpensive way to broaden the mix of plants within a given planting. And even if you have to replant them, they're typically very, very easy to do in large volumes from seed and very efficient. Two big advantages to using annuals, whether exclusively or as parts of broader mixes of plants, is their ability to establish very rapidly from seed to help suppress competition, and also, pardon me, their ability to flower the first year from seed for some instant gratification in the planting. So when we look at native plants and the availability of native plants, there's basically three ways you can get native plants: seeds, transplants, or bulbs. Seeds are always the least expensive option. You can get hundreds or thousands of seeds for the price of a single transplant. But not all native plants, just like not all ornamental plants, are practical to do from seed, and so the availability is not always there. Individual seeds have a relatively lower success rate. However, when you're planting out hundreds of seeds at a time, the overall success of a seed planting is still usually pretty effective. Many plants, for example, the reseeding annuals are a good example of that. Many plants are only available as seeds. That's the only way you're going to find sea blush, for example. You don't find transplants of sea blush to plant. It's always done from seed. Generally speaking, your annuals from seed are first year flowers, but many perennials can be direct seeded and as well, but they usually take several years to establish. Timing of planting seeds is very important. Our seeds have some relatively specific dormancy considerations. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end. We talk about doing this. But you can't just pick up a package of seed in June because you're in the garden center and go home and plant it. You have to match the growing needs of those specific plants. Transplants are always the most expensive way to plant anything. And again, not all plants are available as transplants, like we mentioned with annuals in particular. Transplants typically have the highest overall success rate in planting. That's part of what you're paying for with the dollars, is more established, more mature plants that will be more resilient going in. Some plants are just not readily available either as seeds or bulbs, either because they're clonally propagated from cuttings or because it's impractical to offer them as seeds and bulbs because of long-term, takes a long time for them to establish up to a sellable point, or some are just plain difficult from seed. The big advantage to transplants, of course, is you can garden when you want to garden, and you're not hostage to the seasons. You can actually handle transplants year-round. Bulbs are kind of in between. Native bulbs in particular are more expensive than you might think. They're more expensive than buying daffodil bulbs, for example. Obviously, not all types of plants actually set a storage organ that is transplantable. When we say bulbs, we're talking about bulbs and corms and rhizomes and occasionally tubers, all of those broadly categorized as bulbs. Bulb planting is usually a very successful endeavor, and because you're buying a more established plant, albeit as a dormant storage organ, many of the bulbs flower the first year or at worst second year from planting. Most of the plants you can get as bulbs, you can also get as transplants, and often enough as seeds as well. However, some of them, because of demand considerations or difficulty handling during dormant periods, are only very rarely seen as transplants. So while you could do Calochortus as a transplant, in practice, you almost never see them offered in the trade. They're a difficult plant to grow a bulb into a pot and then transplant out. The success rate isn't so high. Like with seeding, there's a short season for bulbs. In fact, planting of bulbs is a much shorter season of availability because they start growing really right away in the winter, and you don't have the cushion of time you have on seeds and seed germination. So brief period in the fall is the only time you can handle most native bulbs. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about some individual species. I got, I don't know, 21 or 22 to cover here. Give you a little more example of what you can do and some details about them, and then we'll talk a little bit more about how to make this work. So yarrow, our native yarrow is different from the commercial yarrows you see commonly in the garden centers, although it is the parent of a lot of those varieties. Our typical native yarrow flowers white, as you can see in the photo. We say that advisedly because in practice, if you see a big batch of yarrow in the wild, you'll see a lot of whites, you'll see some pale pinks, you might see an occasional yellow intermixed in. And those are all normal variation ranges. And if you plant a package of yarrow seed, you can expect to have some diversity like that. Yarrow is a highly adaptable plant, grows in sun, partial shade, actually substantial amounts of shade, though its performance suffers as you get really noticeably dark, noticeably out of the sun. Drought tolerance is good. Wet soil tolerance to the point of waterlogged soils is not. Doesn't mind some moisture, particularly during the early parts of its growing season, but substantially wet soils or very, very heavy clay does deter it somewhat, unless you can ameliorate those soil conditions. Yarrow is one of those high success natives that we're always happy to be selling because in seed or as transplant. Because it's very, very easy to do in a wide variety of conditions and highly successful, whether transplanted or sown from seed. Like with most of our native plants done by seed, fall through winter is our seeding period. Yarrow has a little more tolerance than some, and you could get well into the mid to late spring and still have good germination and development on yarrow. The flowering onions, these are not your wild onion weeds in your sidewalks, lawns, and gardens. We have quite a wide number of allium species that are native to Oregon, and several that are either truly native in the valley or well-adapted Oregon natives that aren't widespread incredibly locally. Alliums are perennial, some of them shorter lived than others, but generally fairly consistent. They grow in sun or partial shade. They do not tolerate any substantial amounts of shade. Most, but not all alliums are quite adapted to wet soils. Typically, however, they grow in soils that are wet during their winter to spring to very early summer or late spring growing and flowering cycle, but then dry out for the dormant period. And only a few of the flowering onions do well in soils that are consistently wet all summer long. So that is a limiting factor for them in highly irrigated landscapes or true wetland environments. Many of the alliums, particularly Allium implectans you see here, are available as bulbs or as seeds. Some of the others don't bulb up incredibly well or don't dormant long enough for good establishment from bulbs. And the nodding onion is a classic example. Allium cernium is a classic example of an onion that is really better done as a transplant, because when you would want to be handling it as a bulb, it still has leaves up, or already has leaves up, and is actively growing, making it somewhat harder to handle as a bulb. Available as transplants or seeds for some, bulbs for many. Excellent plant. Don't undervalue the flowering onions because of their weedy cousins. They're exquisite pollinator plants with excellent performance characteristics. One of those iconic Western wildflowers, the Western columbine. This is our red columbine that is most common here in the valley and the foothills. A truly perennial plant with a really staggering array of blooms in the summer. Typically grown in sun to partial shade. Again, fairly adaptable as you get into moderate shade, but not super dark shade. Western columbine is very drought tolerant, though it will go significantly dormant as we heat up and dry out in tough sites. It is not very wet soil tolerant, typically grown on hillsides or other well-drained locations. Western columbine can be done by seed fairly readily, or by transplants. Theoretically, you can get columbine crowns. In practice, if you were doing a big order with a native specialist nursery specifically for a restoration project, you might consider doing that way to have some more mature plants going in. But the crowns don't hold for sale well, so you're not likely to find them available where native bulbs are sold retail. Would be a special consideration. Showy milkweed, Asclepias speciosa. This is our local native milkweed for Western, or most of Western Oregon and out to the coast. Fully perennial, a bit of a thug, has an alarming tendency to spread by rhizomes as well as by reseeding to some extent. This is a critical habitat plant for butterflies, as most are aware, particularly for the local populations of monarchs. So monarch butterflies, if you've noted, are there's a couple of disjunct populations that they're distinctly separate, and the ones that we tend to see here in Western Oregon tend to winter in California, come up the coast, and then in. They like our milkweed, or some of the California milkweeds like Asclepias fasciculatus. They are not as fond of, though they will certainly make use of, the more traditional garden milkweeds like Asclepias tuberosa. The huge flocks of monarchs that go all the way to Mexico for the winter and then come up to the Midwest prefer the prairie native Asclepias tuberosa. Very perennial, very persistent when well established, a bit difficult to cite. We list them as drought tolerant, but they also need some moisture during their early growing phases. You'll typically find them in the wild on sites like ditch lines, not down in the water of the ditch, but not clear away from the ditch where everything is well drained, but in that transition moisture zone where there's a good amount of moisture during the early parts of the growing season. Only partially shade tolerant, and I would even hedge that a bit. I really like to see milkweed growing in effectively full sun. A bit coarse with those big broad leaves and kind of rangy habit, easily 3 feet tall when established. So do plan ahead for the site. Showy milkweed there's been a lot of encouragement of people trying to plant milkweeds, particularly showy milkweed, from seed, and that's a royal pain. It doesn't germ well. It's very challenging to do from seed. Usual process, if you're going to do showy milkweed from seed, is you germinate seedlings in a container, you grow them on for 2 or 3 years, and then transplant them out. Direct sowing, it's a very low percentage game. You can get showy milkweed as a transplant, which is usually a very established section of tuber that has been potted up and had a chance to root. Or you can actually buy the actual rhizomes themselves and plant them out. Rhizomes are an inexpensive way to do it and extremely effective, but the window of availability is quite brief. Frequently, we see them in the fall. Sometimes we see them coming in as late as early January for availability as rhizome. Other than that, transplants are widely available through the growing season and highly successful. Key pollinator plant besides the monarchs as well. You see all kinds of bees and other butterflies utilizing the nectaries in particular. So harvest lily, kind of a long-term favorite of me. I like underdog plants to an extent. Brodias, there's several, and in fact, a couple of the other plants we'll talk about a little further on used to be in Brodia, but they've been separated out into separate genera. So it's a broad group of plants, often called harvest lilies. Like the native camas, the indigenous peoples ate a lot of harvest lily bulbs where they were available. A very small bulb, but quite nutritious. So very perennial. And growing in sun to partial shade, typically not substantial amounts of shade. Brodias are all drought tolerant. Their typical habitats are hillsides. Some will tolerate winter flooding. However, in general, they still like to be summer dry. So during their dormant period, they do not want a lot of irrigation. Brodias are really easy to grow from bulb. They're one of the less expensive native bulbs to get your hands on. And while the individual plants are relatively small, they do tend to naturalize pretty effectively over time, becoming a slowly increasing mass of flowers. This group exhibits a trait that is really common, really illustrates well a trait that's really common for a lot of our native bulbs, in that the leaves will come up in the spring, or actually late winter and into spring. And you'll sit there looking at these grassy leaves for a fairly extensive period of time. And then as we get drying down in the late spring and early summer, those leaves will start to wither and go dormant. And that's when the flower stalk comes out and opens. So a lot of times you'll be looking at these in the wild, and you'll see your flower and you can't really tell what it's attached to. So you got a flower stalk with a few open flowers and no visible foliage. It's already begun to significantly die back. An interesting characteristic that shows a substantial adaptation to our very specific weather conditions here. Mariposas, so Calochortus tolmii is our local native. There are a lot of different mariposas or pussy ears that are native throughout Oregon, California, but this is the only one that occurs wild here in the valley. Substantially perennial, tends to be pretty enduring in a well-established site. Well-established for Calochortus means drainage needs to be particularly good. They are not very wet soil tolerant. They're quite drought tolerant and more adaptable to sun or shade than they are to soil conditions. They prefer full sun. They're fairly adapted to reasonable amounts of shade as well. Calochortus is a bit infamous for being difficult to establish. They are a temperamental bulb. A lot of problems we see with mariposas is they're not planted in the right sites, or they're planted in, again, sites that get too much irrigation in the spring. They will not tolerate that. They really need to be dry during their dormant period. They are available usually as bulb, is usually the only way you'll see them. Very rarely you'll find some transplants available, typically during their blooming cycle in spring only. If you get mariposas as a transplant, you're definitely ahead to let them finish flowering and dormant down before you try to transplant them. Transplanting them in growth is very difficult for them. Of course, camas, another one of those illustrative plants that shows that you are in the West. Wetland plant, very wet soil tolerant, including zones that are flooded in the winter. There's a couple of species locally. The two dominant species locally are Camassia quamash, the common camas, usually slightly shorter, and Camassia lakelinii, which is, they call it giant camas. In practice, if you set them side by side, you have trouble telling them apart without getting down to actually looking at the shape and connection of the flower petals. They're similar enough generally to be very, very, very hard to separate. Camases will tolerate quite a wide variety of sun exposures. They do prefer full sun. They're a typical meadow plant. Camassia quamash in particular, though, will tolerate a bit more shade. Camassia lakelinii is very common all over the wetlands out here. You see that out on the OSU property out by the horse barns when the whole wet meadow out there turns bright blue in the spring. One of the things I love about camas is, unlike so many of our native plants, it's really quite an easy plant to work with. You can do it from seed, you can do it from transplants, you can do it from bulbs. Success rate is pretty high amongst all the others. If you don't want to invest a huge amount of prep time and planting dollars into doing a huge clump of camas, you can put a few in and it just as the seeds ripen, just hand harvest the seeds and scatter them out right in the same spot, and you will get a expanding patch of camas over time. A very easy plant to establish and enjoy. Okay, a true annual here. Farewell to Spring, or Clarkia amina, subspecies amina is our local variant. Kind of an ephemeral spring bloomer, end of the spring cycle, easily done from seed, and tends to reseed well. Again, here in the valley, immediately, sometimes we have problems with the seed on our clay soils not persisting long enough. You may have to reestablish them periodically. Excellent drought tolerance, very common component of more sloped locations than valley clay. Sun to part shade, but really definitely prefer sun. They tend to get leggy and less than attractive if grown in any substantial amounts of shade. Easy plant to grow from seed, high success rate, and that's really likely the only way you'll ever see them is from seed. Ukao, funny name, but a pleasant enough plant. It's another one of those harvest lily cousins. It used to be in Brodia at one time before they separated out that genus. Diclostemum congesta is our local version of that. A truly perennial bulb, easily grown in sun or shade, drought tolerant, and a bit to the tolerant of spring to winter moisture, but not flooded sites. You can occasionally find Diclostemma available as seed. It is usually handled as bulb and naturalizes quite well, better than a lot of the other harvest lily group, actually. Better to establish solid clones. Nice mid to late spring blooming addition to the garden. And picture shows the flowers blue. There's some variation in them. They tend to be, I would say, overall a bit paler than the photo may indicate. Be aware of that. Shooting star. Okay, we have a lot of shooting stars all over the western U.S. Dodecathion hendersonii is our local native here. They are very perennial and are easily handled. They're another one of those high success plants. The problem is that sometimes the way you want to handle them isn't necessarily the easiest way to handle them. We love to be able to handle them strictly from bulbs, but the bulbs are fragile and a little bit lacking persistence. You have to store them just right until you get them in the ground. So often a plant that's easier to do from transplant, but if you time it and get them in the ground right after you purchase them in the late fall, usually late October, early November, they can be very successful from bulbs as well. Quite drought tolerant, but also liking some spring moisture. You'll often find that again for hendersonii, different shooting stars from different areas have slightly different needs. You typically find them in open meadows where there is some spring moisture, but not again waterlogged, and that do drain down well in the summer. A surprisingly tough plant once you've got it established. I once had a client gift me a digging of dodecathions from her yard, and I didn't have a spot set aside for them, so I just took them. They were just literally dug up with a little bit of soil around them. I took them home. I threw them out in partial shade environment on top of some ground cloth until I could do with them, and then promptly got caught up in other things and lost track of them. And then next spring, they started growing and flowering right there on top of the weed barrier fabric. So when established, pretty tough. The bulbs themselves a bit fragile, so handle with care. Fawn lily, gorgeous native. Erythronium oregonum is our local here on the coast. Yellow to very pale yellow, almost white in many cases. Erythronium revolutum is the pink one that is native on the Oregon coast, and you'll also see that one available periodically. This is a shade plant, shade to part shade, typically growing in mixed ground cover in the woods. Drought tolerant and does not appreciate summer irrigation. We often like to use erythronium in a mixed planting to be like a lawn replacement situation where you can mix it with some native ground covers and some other herbs and forbs and get a fairly uniform coverage that doesn't require the feeding and mowing and watering of a turf. Will also established into grass as well, but must be an unirrigated site for that. Erythronium is often available as transplants, is most economically planted from bulbs. Bulbs are fairly tolerant and durable. It's a good way to handle them when you can. Chocolate lily, Fritillaria affinis, pushes the margins really of native. We don't normally see it down here in the valley, more Siskiyous, foothills type situations. Very perennial from a bulb, like most of the lily family are. Sun to partial shade, I would suggest towards the sunnier end, not towards the shadier end for fritillarias. Another plant that really resents irrigation in the summer, quite drought tolerant and easily adapted to well-drained sites. Never an easy plant. Fritillaria affinis is notorious for being finicky about getting established. Once they're established, they persist really well, but you may take 2 or 3 attempts before you get a clump established. Usually only available as a bulb for that reason. They really resent disturbance during their growing season. Gilia, this is our local native called bluehead or blue gilia. Gilia capitata, a critical pollinator plant, a major bee resource, particularly for our native solitary bees, our smaller bees. Easily established from seed in sunny or light shade environments. Drought tolerant, like a lot of our wildflowers, drought tolerant because it tends to be from drained locations. Seed is the only way you're likely to see this plant. And is an easy plant to establish from seed. Our native irises, roughly locally, Iris tenax and Iris douglasiana are pretty common. There are several other irises if you go up and down the valley, particularly as you get out to the gorge, but these are our dominant group here. They are very perennial and persist for long periods of time. Once you're established, they're very, very successful plant and component of your landscape. They do like sun. Both of them will tolerate quite reasonable amounts of shade. They are drought tolerant and do not thrive in super saturated or true wetland environments very well. Our native irises can be grown well from seed, but it takes usually about 3 years from seed to first flower. Our native irises also do not develop the types of tubers or rhizomes that make some of the non-native irises commonly available as bulbs. You will sometimes find them available as crown divisions. You can, of course, once you've got your own clump established, you can divide your own. They're very easy to dig sections up of rooted crown and just simply relocate them. But that's a slow process. You want to make sure you're not only up to flowering age, but you're 2 or 3 years into flowering age. So you've got a decent sized clump that when you divide it, you're not suddenly setting the plant back so far. It's going to take time to, again, get back up to blooming age. They will often reseed themselves moderately as well. So planting a solitary plant will typically result in occasional sporadic clumps coming up elsewhere. So the seed on Iris tenax can be a bit difficult to get good germination from. Iris douglasiana is kind of similar. They're often, if you're doing them from seed, not broadcast seeded like a lot of the annual flowers are, but are started specifically in containers to get a little bit more mature crown for transplanting. So you can go from seed into a container, grow it out for a year, plant it out the following year quite effectively. Seeds that you're going to be doing that way really should be pre-soaked. In the wild, they're used to cold stratification, lots of moisture and germinate that way, but it's best to speed that cycle along if you're doing them in containers. Lupins. We have a batch of lupins out here. Lupinus polyphyllus and Lupinus latifolia are pretty common. That nice picture from our own native landscape here at the nursery, I know. Some lupins are fairly perennial, but tending to be relatively short-lived. Other lupins are effectively biennial, just a 2-year cycle. They do have a tendency to reseed aggressively, to set lots of seed and have a lot of that seed being viable. So planting a few and letting them naturalize in is definitely a way to go. Most of our lupins here, lupins generally are listed as drought tolerant. A batch of our lupins are actually wetland contingent plants where they're wet in the winter and dry in the summer. And so they're more adaptable to soils than you might think. None of our native lupins really love saturated clay. They are better in as you get upslope or in some drainage. So you will need to likely do at least a little soil amending to have a good establishment of lupin on the valley floor here in Corvallis. They're often available as transplants, as well as available from seed in certain cases. Question in the chat, I thought only the light blue lupin is native. Okay, and this is, we'll kick back a slide too and talk a little bit about iris colors. So lupins, irises, both exhibit quite a bit of flower color diversity within their species. So what you see in the picture here is our local valley native Lupinus polyfolius. It is often pale blue, and you can see some blue tinges. It often ends up tawny, buff, tan, or pale yellow with occasional white sporadic blooms within the group. If you look at a large native grouping of lupins, you'll find lupins of every shade and color intermixed. Other lupins, not local native, but Oregon native, some of the really high alpine ones, you often see two morphs within a given plant, and you'll often see a really intensely purple blue and then an absolutely white flowered form. And they're the same species, that's just the genetic variation. Our native irises, both Douglassiana and Tenax, also exhibits that. It's really, really common to see them that kind of purpley, off blue to purple color, but any given patch in the wild will have occasional yellow, white, or other off-color members, and that's simply genetic diversity. I will note that from this particular planting of bigleaf lupin, that most of the stand, and it has reseeded itself, so it's not just the one plant, have tended to hold this basic color pattern. So genetic diversity, on display in that sense. And we're likely to see that vary again over time as that stand reseeds itself. A little plant that you hardly ever see available, but is a common component of our native landscapes, our native wildflower beds, Plectridis congestum, the sea blush, a true annual with a tendency to reseed quite well. Sun preferred, will tolerate some shade, drought tolerant, and again, one of the reasons you don't see as much of it right down here on the valley floor, it doesn't really thrive in really, really wet soils. You'll typically find it growing upslope on hillsides, scattering itself amongst partially rotted logs where there's a good drainage through the bark material, that kind of thing. Naturalizes well, inexpensive and easy to do from seed. A nice way to get a really quick, if somewhat ephemeral cover on a site that you get some cover on to suppress competition. Low plant, I mean, so just a few inches tall. Flowers are not individually large, but in mass they provide a pretty good show and an excellent resource for some of our earlier bees in particular. Self-heal or heal-all, Perennial vulgaris, our subspecies lanceolata. Truly perennial, easy plant to grow in a variety of conditions. You see it growing in fairly shady environments in the woods pretty widely. You'll also see it, and probably have seen it if you're looking closely, encroaching out of the shade and into even maintained turf. Any spot where there's some good moisture for it to establish into, but it's not waterlogged. So we'll tolerate reasonable amounts of sun, provided the conditions don't get too harsh over the summer. A very easy plant to grow from transplant and quite easy to do from seed as well. Naturalizes itself well, not only by reseeding, but also by crawling, making it one of the better native ground covers. We don't have a lot of true ground covers in our native panoply of plants, and Perennial vulgaris is a substantially effective one. Mix that with some of those fawn lilies and maybe some larger herbaceous perennials like wild geranium, and you have an instant fill-in that doesn't get too many weeds. It's got a pretty solid cover on it. Checker mallows, three significantly for Western Oregon. Sidalcia cusickii, Sidalcia virgata, and Sidalcia campestris. Campestris tends to be paler. What you see there in the picture is virgata. Campestris is also more shade tolerant and a bit later, by quite a margin, the latest of the Sidalcias to blooming. I've seen them blooming here in the low foothills near the valley floor and into July. In well irrigated or wetland sites, they will continue to bloom well into the summer, however. Typically in the wild, they don't because everything dries out. As you can see in the picture, we've gotten fond of using these in ponds and water features. They will tolerate shallow water immersion and moving water, though not stagnant bogs very well. Quite wet soil tolerant. Often available as seed, also often available as transplants. Sidalcia virgata is relatively short-lived perennial. Both cusickii and campestris seem to be a bit longer-lived. May reseed themselves, and we do tend to see a lot of little seedlings coming up in the gravel as we go along the edges of those ponds. A tall perennial makes a pretty solid statement in the landscape. In the picture there, those are probably 30 inches tall, so quite a solid array of flowers when they're in bloom. The third plant in the group that was broadly in the Harvest Lily Alliance, Tritelia hyacinthina, also called white brodea. You see a lot of Tritelias being used these days, non-native Tritelias being used these days as ornamental bulbs from fall planting as well. Our native is this one. Looks really white, but when you really do look at them up close, they've got bands or stripes of blue that give them just a faint hazy blue cast. Tritelias like sun better than shade, will tolerate some shade, and like so much of this Harvest Lily Alliance, will tolerate some moisture in the growing season, but prefer dry conditions during their dormant cycle. One of the better naturalizers of the native bulbs as well. You'll typically find them available as bulbs, often exclusively, and rarely you'll see them as established transplants for planting yourself. I have to throw in Trillium to talk about in a discussion like this. I love the plant. I don't really encourage Trillium for beginning level playing with native plants because they're quite finicky. They hate disturbance. When you buy a Trillium plant or a Trillium bulb, you're buying usually 4 or 5 years worth of age. Because it takes that long from seed to develop out to that effectively flowering age. So not simple, but in a moist shade environment, Trilliums are a wonderful plant. If you're going to buy them and plant and play with them, bulbs are probably the best way to handle them. But even the growers who produce this stuff have challenges getting crops to be completely successful. So you'll sometimes find 2 or 3 year periods of time when you don't find any native Trilliums available in the stores because there's no crop out there. It has not been successful. So right site, moist shade, get them in that site and don't disturb them. Some of them more tricky than others, but all of them temperamental. Another color note on that, you'll see the vast majority of the Trilliums that we'll see out here are white, and then they age, some of them age to that deep, almost magenta over time. They don't often start out with that deep magenta color. Some of them are sessile, as you see in the picture here, where the flower is directly attached to the conjoined triple leaves. Others are stemmed, where the flower is borne on a short stem above that. And that's one of the easy ways to tell the different species apart for wild identification. Mule's ear. Okay, mule's ear always throws me here when we talk about local native wildflowers because I'm used to seeing these up at elevation in Eastern Oregon primarily, and they're widespread in the steens as well. Wildflower angustifolia is native out here on the valley floor. You'll find it out at Finley. You'll find it out in a lot of undisturbed sites. Drought tolerant, and for angustifolia, tolerant of seasonal moisture, though not underwater conditions typically in the winter, but even squishy in the winter, fairly marshy in the winter, just not truly underwater. Superbly drought tolerant when established. and not shade tolerant at all. Definitely a full sun environment, a very typical meadow wildflower. You can get Wyothea as transplants. It's often handled that way. It is available as seed, and it's not a bad idea if you want to establish a fairly substantial planting of them to do it from seed. But you do need to seed them pretty heavily. The overall seed viability rate is notably low. So plant a lot more seed than you think you need to get them established. A little bit challenging that way. As they mature, they develop quite a substantial root system, which is what gives them their superb drought tolerance. And they tend to inhibit competition. As you can see from the picture, that large rosette of very substantial strappy leaves tends to kind of choke out most of the things that would try to compete with them. So a good overview on some of the native plants that wildflowers that we can do from seed and bulk. We're going to talk a little bit more now about doing this. Let's start off with talking about planting native bulbs. Native bulbs need to be planted during the wet parts of the fall, and ideally don't wait too long. They need to be able to get some growing going on during the late fall and winter. That's why they actually break dormancy at this point. Some of them are not easy to handle from a grower standpoint because it takes them a long time to hydrate up and be able to be dug and handled. But then they want to start growing right away after that. So they have a relatively brief period when they're easily handleable, but not getting too late for them. Real critical with our native bulbs to match the site to the plant. So many of our native bulbs are from drier sections of Western Oregon, not from wet clay valley. And many of them really do not like summer irrigation. Now, yes, they're native here. Yes, they will adapt to local growing conditions pretty well. That being said, our clay out here in Corvallis in particular is infamously difficult for establishing plants in. So it is a good idea to do substantial soil amendment when you're planting native bulbs, at least a medium-sized hole per bulb, and with plenty of coarse compost mixed in, so that we have a chance to for those to root out and not just suffocate in that dense matted clay. Things like Brodia in particular, some of the alliums will tolerate our wet and heavier soils well once you've got them basically established through their first couple of years. Particularly important with Calochortus, Erythronium, and Fritillaria that they do not get summer irrigation here. They need dry dormant periods. They'll just rot if you're irrigating them. So native bulbs can be planted singly and let them slowly amend out, or planted in small groupings. Typically, the expense of native bulbs is such that we don't do large-scale drifts like you might with daffodils and tulips. We're more likely to do several small clusters of native bulbs and then encourage them to naturalize themselves instead of planting tons and tons of them, because they're not super cheap like a daffodil or tulip or crocus. Different native bulbs have different depth requirements. Not surprising, that's true for most bulbs. We have a couple of them that are notably shallow. The Fritillaria affinis and the Dodecathion shooting stars really like to be planted quite shallow, usually just about 2 inches below the soil surface. In the medium range, the typical planting depth of a handspan, say 4 to 6 inches, almost all the alliums, native alliums, the harvest lily group, including the oocows, but not the tritelias. And camas really like to be down in that 4 to 6 inch range. Fawn lilies in our heavier soils, I would go to the shallow end of that. If you have a particularly well-drained site, go on down. Deeper plantings, Calochortus, the mariposas, the big camas, and the hyacinth brodia, the tritelias, really like to be further down, 6, 7, maybe even as much as 8 inches deep, depending on, again, how heavy and wet your soil might be. So planting of seeds, the majority of the plants of our native wildflowers that you can do from seed are winter germinating seeds. requiring a fairly extensive period of cool to cold, wet weather to germinate. Extensive meaning 12, 14, 16 weeks of cold, wet weather. So typically that means we plant them October, November, maybe December. They will germinate over that course of that late winter and early spring and establish up through the spring season. They will go, most of them go dormant in the summer anyway. There are certainly tricks around that. For example, if you're off season but you really need to get a crop going, you can start them out in flats and refrigerate them to get 12 weeks of cold wet germination, cold stratification, and then once they've started growing, you can lift them out of the flats and transplant them. That's a pretty common approach for restoration work. Many of the perennials as well really do still require that cold stratification. It's not just our annual wildflowers. In many cases, they are better to establish into a pot and maybe even grow them on for a year or even two before transplanting them out rather than direct sowing them. It's particularly true, as I mentioned earlier, about the irises. Not the easiest plant to direct seed. They do very well from starting a transplant and then even planting out within the year. Coverage. So when you buy wildflower seeds, there's all kinds of recommendations. You can go from whatever packaging is given. There's usually some sort of indications on them, or you can go from a restoration company like Heritage Seedlings has a really great information available on a variety of these plants from seed. But broadly speaking, it's really hard to take a needle package of seed and make it cover 100 to 150 to 200 square feet with any degree of consistency and evenness. So what we like to do is we like to take these wildflower seeds or seed, sometimes wildflower grass and seed mixes, and mix them with a substrate, with a filler material. This is usually something that is relatively neutral in pH and relatively inexpensive and not too coarse, not too water retentive, but not too sharply draining either. Real common filler materials would include medium vermiculite, fine coir, coconut fiber. Peat moss will do in a pinch, though it is acidic. For those fortunate or unfortunate ones who are in the grass seed industry and sometimes have whole bags of seed that's like 3 or 4 years old and no longer will germinate, you can use dead grass seed as a filler. The point here is to stretch that seed and get it relatively evenly intermixed into the filler and then spread the filler to cover the amount of area you're covering, guaranteeing at least some kind of consistency to the coverage. My experience with doing this on a small scale, I've never tried to do it on a larger restoration scale, suggests that if you lightly moisten the substrate you're mixing into, add the seed in, stir thoroughly. I usually use a 5-gallon bucket. It's not too hard. It's not too wet at that point to spread it out, but it also just doesn't dust off and fly away the moment you try to put it out. Usually we're looking for 2 to 3 times the volume. In certain seeds, particularly really high density seeds, really small seeds, you might want a bit more filler than that. That's kind of the bottom end of the amount of filler you'd want to use for a seeding project. You don't typically need to do that when you're seeding into containers. You can usually get the seed to settle in. Most of our seeds do not want to be deep. You don't want to be like digging a trench and planting the seeds. They really are surface germinators. So when you're transplanting bulbs, transplants, shrubs, whatever, normally you clear enough of patch to get a plant in the ground. You let it establish, and it tends to manage the competition as long as you police it for a little while. You can get some success that way with overseeding with native seeds, but it's pretty sparse and spare. Certain conditions or certain flowers, like it's not uncommon to intentionally introduce, for example, columbine into a grassed area without completely clearing the soil, clearing it down to bare soil. But if you really want a good density of wildflowers or wildflower and grass mixes, you do need to kind of start with a clean slate. To get that clean slate, you're going to have to deal with the existing vegetation. So this usually means digging or hand pulling or tilling or herbiciding. A good approach where safe and practical is burning, using like a weed torch to burn the area clean. Do exercise due caution if you're taking that approach. Herbicides do not need to be horrible for the environment. There are a batch of organic herbicides that work well. I'm not a fan of the way vinegar works as an herbicide. You might try some of the capriic acid herbicides. They're very effective for site clearing prior to planting. Once you've got the existing vegetation basically dealt with, you need to do anything you're going to do that actually changes the soil grade, whether that's tilling, whether that is resloping, whether that's bringing in soil. And make sure you have a time after that soil change has been done for any seeds that have turned up in the course of that to sprout, and so you can deal with them. Again, about 10, 14 days, usually you've got a pretty good idea for most things of what you're going to see in for weeds. Go through and go ahead and eliminate that existing new weed crop, burning or herbiciding, because you're not going to want to till or dig since you've already finished your soil disturbance. Once you've got effectively a bare site, you're ready to plant the seeds. And again, take this all as make it fit your specific situation. If you're doing a little edge of a flower bed, you probably don't need to get super carried away with getting every weed out. Just seed nice and heavy, and you'll get a good establishment. If you've got a coarse fence line and you're trying to get reasonable establishment of actual native plants instead of the weed grasses and such that have blown in over the last 10 years, you're going to want to take the time to do a good cleaning up in bare soil site, or the native plants will just get choked out before they can establish. So it's kind of an overview on native wildflowers from seed and bulb. There are certainly some other options out there. I highlighted some of the more popular and available options. It's really common to see a look like this as our native display garden, a mixture of wildflowers of all sorts with native grasses. And I do encourage you, if you're thinking about working with native wildflowers, look at the land around you and see how this happens in the wild. And it's usually a mixture of grasses and forbs in these plantings. Grasses are a critical component of our native habitats. But even if you only want to just integrate some natives into an existing non-native landscape, it can be a lot of fun to play with, and I hope you enjoy doing so. And at that point, that's what I had in a prepared presentation. I would entertain any questions any of you have. Okay, question in the chat. Is it better to scatter seeds on a dry day with a break in the rain? So yes, it's pretty miserable trying to spread a mixture of filler and seed in a downpour. Light amounts of moisture certainly do not inhibit. It really is important, though, that you do time this so that you're coming into a wet season. Having a lot of seed on the soil surface that is not germinating right away is asking for rodents and birds to kind of get into it and depredate it, and then will reduce your percentage. So I wouldn't wait around for a bone dry day for sure, but I would avoid the worst of the downpours. Another factor with rain and seeding is that really heavy rain, if there's any degree of irregularity or slope, will tend to pool or slide the seeds, so you'll have uneven distribution. Certainly not a disaster that happens in the wild too, but be aware of that as you're looking at that. And if you've got 4 days of half an inch or more a day of rain coming through, you might wait until a little bit better weather just to avoid some of that problems. All right, any other questions for me? If not, you know where to find me. You can get a hold of me here at Shonnard's, and I would be happy to follow up on any additional questions you might have. Thank you very much for attending. I appreciate it.